Welcome everyone to a very exciting webinar where we will be sharing some practical lessons from the Phoenix Project that we can use today. I hope you and your loved ones are all safe and healthy. My name is Yasser Saeed and I'm part of the Red Hat Public Sector Transformation Office, and I'm looking forward to a very valuable discussion today. It's going to be very pragmatic and rooted in our speaker's research and vast experience in leading transformations, and it's all about exploring the question many of us have. How can I transform more effectively by addressing one of the biggest challenges, the Brent problem of constraints? Now, this is a very vast topic, so we'll just be addressing it at a very high level. And we're very fortunate to have Kevin Baer to walk us through. He is, of course, a luminary in this field, having been a CTO and CIO and advised C-level executives on strategic transformations. As you almost certainly know, Kevin is, of course, the co-author of one of the best-selling IT and transformation books of all time, the groundbreaking The Phoenix Project, which is a novel of organizational change, and it really brings to life the necessity, the challenges, and effective approaches to change in a very real-life way. Kevin is also part of Red Hat's Global Transformation Office, so if your organization would like to schedule an executive exchange on this topic or interested in discussing how to most effectively navigate through transformation or organizational change in general, feel free to reach out to Red Hat and we can look at facilitating that discussion, which we've had with many different organizations, and they've all received it with a lot of excitement. Now, what's especially exciting about this webinar is it's actually a three-part. Not just that it's exciting because it's Kevin, but on top of that, this is a series of 3 webinars that will be recorded. So I encourage you all to invite others in your network to join because they'll be very valuable and they'll be available on demand. And there are literally several dozens of lessons that can be distilled and extracted from the Phoenix Project. So maybe there is a chance that we might even be able to have some ongoing wisdom from Kevin about different lessons in the Phoenix projects that we can use today. But for this webinar series, we're going to be tackling 3 and addressing 3 very important ones, which you already saw as you registered, but on this slide shows a few of the other ones as well. So let's talk about the agenda for this webinar now. And from an agenda perspective, something that's a little bit different is Kevin is a great teacher and a great mentor. He's very passionate about not just giving you some information about this webinar series, but what he wants to do is he wants to go a step further and make sure that folks are actually digesting this information and actually able to use it. So to that end, what's pretty exciting about this webinar is he's actually going to not just give you the lessons, but there's actually going to be some homework, some questions and answers, or some questions and a homework that he'll be assigning as well, which he'll talk about at the end. So we'll first talk about what is a constraint, what is meant by constraints, how can we manage the constraints as from a leadership perspective, how do you manage those constraints, but then also very interestingly, how do you manage the constraint if you are the constraint itself? And then we'll get into the homework and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So with that, I invite Kevin to walk us through the beginning, which is what is meant by constraints.
Thanks, Yasser, for the introduction. Today we're going to talk about constraints, and we're going to start off by what I mean by constraints. Constraints are the weakest links in a chain. So if you think of your system or your company or your organization as a chain of interconnected dependencies, constraint would be the weakest link in those dependencies. Or you could also look at it as the way a system functions. In other words, if a system is constrained, it will produce less than it is capable of. So the constraint would be the thing that causes the system to produce less. Bottlenecks. A lot of people use this term interchangeably with constraint. And while a lot of times that is accurate, it's important to notice that it's obvious in a bottleneck where demand exceeds the design capacity because you can see it. A bottleneck, it's very visual, right? But also remember that bottlenecks are designed in many cases. Sometimes we want to restrict the flow of material through the exit. So a bottleneck is a great way, for example, to make it so that it's easier to pour something. Sometimes really wide things are not very easy to pour, especially into smaller containers. So we often use bottlenecks, and sometimes in industrial systems, we will limit the rate throughput of certain things to control the outcomes on the other side. And so sometimes those can have unintended consequences, or as a system scales and starts to reach output levels it hadn't before, or may not even been designed for, you'll start to see those failures occur, and the rate limit can become an actual constraint. But the big thing to remember is not all constraints are bottlenecks. Sometimes it looks like things have great availability. In terms of, like, you could have a work center on a manufacturing line that has over 70% availability, but it could still be a constraint. Conditions can be compounded in a particular situation. And I think many of us are familiar with what it could feel like in an organization when those dynamic elements come into play, and all of a sudden we have a system where what wasn't a problem is now a problem. So there's a lot of different kinds of constraints, and in the theory of constraints, which is Eliyahu Goldratt's famous body of knowledge and methods and tools, he gives us some definitions of the different kinds of constraints we might face in our companies. Cash constraints, obviously when we run out of cash to actually be able to perform the company's mission, buy inventory in order to make more products, we basically can run out of the ability to operate, which means we're out of business. Market constraints are a little more unusual. Imagine your company or organization had penetrated the market so completely that there were no new customers or no net new available business. That's pretty rare. But we do all suffer from supply constraints, demand constraints, and in some cases, internal capacity constraints. And that's really what the Brent story in the Phoenix Project is about. Brent, the character, is one of these really brilliant people. He actually did work for me in real life and is literally one of the smartest people I've ever met. He'll probably never forgive me for putting his name in this novel. But the point is that Brent's problem has nothing actually in many cases to do with Brent. Brent is just a normal person that wants to help, except he's really good at it. And just like the rest of us, there's a part of him that wants to be helpful and maybe even needs to be helpful. And systems of work in our companies oftentimes do not account for the fact that there are routes that we can take that are much faster than the processes that we all agree we should use. And in many cases, those routes in the Phoenix Project ran directly through Brent. If you wanted to get something done fast, if you had a hard problem and weren't sure you were going to be able to solve it, or if something was really tweaky and you were worried you'd break it, you'd go to Brent because it was faster than thinking yourself. In many cases, you could be done and get credit really fast. So there was a lot of incentives to use Brent. Brent, on the other hand, had work that he was supposed to do. And not being able to do that work really stressed him out, just like you can imagine. And so he had this constant tension of wanting to be helpful, having lots of demand to be helpful, and then also realize that he was falling short on the work he meant to do and that others were depending on him for. So when we have a constraint, it can not only limit us, but it can limit the output or the collective progress of everybody. So, how do we begin to take these things on? I think we all know that we've gone to our management and asked for more of something to make things run smoother, and had the simple answer of do more with less. So rather than gaslighting you, I'm going to actually talk about some solid things that we can do, and they're pretty counterintuitive by nature. So the work that I've been talking about, the theory of constraints, comes from Eliyahu Goldratt, who invented this work in the late 70s and early 80s. The book, The Goal, came out, I believe, around 1983. And this book to date has sold about, well over 3 million copies. And the last version of it that I was able to be a part of, lucky enough to be asked to write a cover inscription of all things for a book that's already sold 3 million copies, is released pretty recently. And it's the 30th edition, I believe, at this point, 30th edition of The Goal. And one of the things that's really awesome about this new edition is that it actually packs an amazing article that Ellie had written called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And it is a great article and is actually inserted into the updated version of this. So if you're going to buy the goal, I recommend you get the 30th anniversary edition. And you can look for the fact that I endorsed a book that needed no endorsement. I think it's one of the best books from a business perspective that I've ever read. So in the goal, there's a story, and basically there's a protagonist. It's a novel, and you can read this in a weekend. It's a great book. Like I said, one of my favorites, and is actually required reading in many MBA programs. And it identifies this notion of constraints, right, that we talked about, the things that are constrained or are not available in our organization that limit the output of the whole system. And he actually outlines in that book 5 focusing steps that you can take when you identify a constraint. And it's really, really important. So the first thing is, how do you identify a constraint? And like we talked about, the constraint being the most limiting thing in a system, oftentimes they're not super hard to spot. In a manufacturing system, you could just simply look to the left of the constraint that you think is a constraint and see if work is piling up in front of the constraint. So the first step is identifying that system's constraint. And basically, if you're going to strengthen the link in a chain, right, you have to find its weakest link, right? And basically, if you are managing a constraint and you don't know where it is, like a lot of people will say, hey, listen, I have multiple constraints. And what we have to do is find the worst and then work from there. A lot of times, if we start working on multiple constraints at one time, we're creating a multivariable experiment. And I can guarantee you that the constraints will simply move. And sometimes they'll become compound and complex. So we want to make sure that we find the one point where we can see readily that is the most constrained. So step 2, and I'm going to use the word exploit, and we need to be very careful about this word because in our current world, it does not have a good connotation. In this scenario, it literally has nothing to do with the bad use of the word. Basically, we want to make sure that in this case, that the constraint is working on nothing but the most important task. Like I said, many times when we analyze the activities of a constraint, the constraint will actually be doing more, like 50% or more of its capacity on things that have nothing to do with its most important work. So the first step, let's make sure we understand what is constrained. The second step, let's make sure that the constraint is focused purely on the things that we need them to do, no distractions, right? And we must be well utilized at this point, because if we're not, right, that could literally be part of why this resource is constrained. And so we need to be able to get them to the maximum availability. So any simple improvements we can make around the constraint at this point, we want to do to get them as available as we can. The focusing step number 3, that's really, really important, after we've made sure the constraint is doing nothing but working on the work that it's supposed to do and ignoring all of the distractions or any other subsequent work that's popped up, we want to make sure to subordinate everything else to the constraint. Now, subordinate is a tough word for humans. None of us like to subordinate. Matter of fact, in America, we've gone a long way to talk about how we don't have to subordinate to anything. We have a Bill of Rights that tells us what we don't have to subordinate to. We have a Constitution. And so most of us don't love that word, especially in relation to each other. And so in the scenario of subordinate, I want to make sure I'm very clear. When we're talking about a constraint, the output of the entire system or the output of your entire group is limited by the constraint. So you're already limited. So the big thing we have to look at is, how do we actually get what we want, the output, by maybe adjusting what it is that we want. In other words, I'm not going to ask a question of the constraint while they're working. I'm going to subordinate to the fact that they're already fully busy. If I was having the constraint do some work for me, I now know that it can no longer do that. And I have to live with that. Matter of fact, I have to more than live with that. I have to figure out another way to get the work done. Subordinating takes on the actual effort that it takes to work around a constraint. If we're going to actually demand that the constraint do nothing but focus on the work that is the most important thing, then we have to make sure in our subordination that we support that happening, that we don't meddle with the constraint, and in no way do we take their time away from the most important tasks. Also, schedules need to subordinate. Meetings need to subordinate. Everything that is an activity that is not the critical work that this constraint needs to be doing, we get rid of that. The fourth focusing step is the step that most people go to first. Elevation really implies we're going to invest. So if we're going to invest at the constraint, we want to make sure that we know, A, it's doing everything it can to do all of the right work and not focusing on the wrong things, that the rest of the organization is buying into that prioritization and subordinating and eliminating any work that's not necessary for that constraint to achieve its tasks. So when we talk about elevating it, now we're talking about getting out the wallet. This is where we talk about allocating budget, or perhaps more staff to that point. Or maybe we use continuous process improvement. That's what we should do. Use continuous process improvement to actually decide on both sides of the constraint improvements we could make that will actually improve the performance of the constraint. So we had actually set out to do some kata, and like the improvement kata, and actually run a bunch of steps and sequences and experiments to see what we could do. So elevating the constraint implies investment. We might even decide to buy something. If we need to invest in a piece of software and or a piece of infrastructure or some sort of a service or subscription that will help us, then we're going to do that here. So the fifth step to remember is we got to prevent inertia. We don't want basically the elevated constraint. We may actually have that weak link reoccur, or it may remain the weakest, or it may actually even move. And that could be frustrating when your constraint moves, because then you need to do what you need to do anyway, which is start at step one, re-identify the constraint, right? And move through, exploit the constraint, subordinate it, and elevate it again. Matter of fact, whenever we elevate, it's important to remember that we need to go back to the beginning, not stay in investment. It's very important to realize that this is a loop through one time, not stay at a particular step forever. So in order to kind of get rid of that inertia, we need to start the process again. That's why Eliyahu used to call it the process of ongoing improvement. I prefer to call it continuous improvement, or the improvement kata that Toyota uses. So when we look at those 5 steps, we can see that there's a very ordered, very simple way to make sure that we actually alleviate the problem at the point of constraint. It's also, by the way, in the order of things that your management will want to hear. In other words, the first thing they're going to say to you is, make sure that it's doing everything that it can to focus on the work. Did you make sure of that? Okay, great. Did you make sure that everybody else is helping the constraint and getting the job done? Oh, you did. Great. Okay, I think I might be ready to spend some money on that constraint right now. So in other words, you've gone through a logical path. You've followed a path that you're going to use every time. And that language will begin to foreshadow what it is that you're going to ask for in a really normal and accessible way. So very, very important. So one of the things that we have in the story in the Phoenix Project, how do we scale Brent? In other words, so Brent's the constraint. So what do we do with Brent? So we literally follow these focusing steps, and we come back to the notion of we've got to identify Brent as the constraint, which we've done in the book. And then now we need to actually have interventions where Brent is actually being pulled away from, in many cases, his work at the point of constraint, right? So the work that he needs to do is sitting idle. It's now in wait time. There is no active touch time. And so the thing we need to do with Brent is the following example. So Brent gets interrupted because there's a network outage. And turns out Brent knows how to configure BGP and nobody else does. So one of the engineers in the network group who had the problem brings up Brent. Hey, Brent, got a network problem and I could use your help. Could you log into the following device and could you connect to this? And so, Brent starts to reach towards the keyboard and then he remembers something. He remembers that his manager said something to the effect of, you're constrained, and if you're trying to do work and somebody interrupts you, you need to do the following thing. You need to make sure that you use channeling, Brent. And basically what channeling is just like it sounds. Brent doesn't actually get to log into the machine. Brent pairs with the person who's going to log into the machine, except Brent's hands aren't on the keyboard. So Brent is literally acting as a guide to the person doing the work. And the goal is skills transfer. It may not all happen at once, but it's certainly not going to happen if somebody just tries to watch Brent type at like 300 words per minute. It's not going to happen when you don't have any frame of reference for knowing why he typed what he typed and what the responses were he was expecting. So by having Brent actually partner with you and then actually allow you to do it, and then you rely on Brent where you don't have the form, again, we can start to do shu, ra, ri. Learn it exactly as it is, perform it exactly as it is, and then we can make it our own. So the nice thing that we're doing with Brent is he already would have gotten interrupted. In this case, we're just making sure that he doesn't have to continually get interrupted by not allowing him to play back the solution at light speed in a way that we can't see. This is how Brent can make us all smarter. This is how a constraint can actually make an organization more resilient, right? Because if every time we have a problem and Brent is the only one who knows how it was fixed, the organization does not improve and does not get smarter collectively. It goes backwards. Brent gets smarter and we don't. So what's very important to think about is, does it make the system better? And so if we have to interrupt Brent, it must make the system better and less likely to interrupt Brent again. So channeling versus the digital model, and by digital I mean the hands on the keyboards model, it's very, very important to understand that channeling is the way to go whenever we're trying to alleviate constraints. It can feel like we don't have enough time and that Brent is faster than actually doing this. That is an illusion. It's faster right now. The second this reoccurs, it's now twice as much work that you've created. And every time after that is a multiple. It's very important to think about the long game here. So another side of this discussion is, how does it feel to be the constraint? I will tell you that many times in the teams that I've worked on, I have been the constraint and sometimes remain the constraint. And when folks are trying to do things that you understand are ways to manage you, to get more productivity out of you, to block other people from working with you, it can feel strange. Matter of fact, I tend to feel a little bit singled out. Sometimes I get a little defensive because at the heart of it, for me, sometimes like I feel that I should be able to do everything, right? All of the things that are in my head, all of the things I know I can do, I should be able to bring that to bear. And I know that I just simply can't. But nonetheless, somehow I feel like a failure when I can't do all the things that people ask me to and the things that I'm supposed to do. So feeling when you're the constraint often can be very conflicted. You can feel insecure about your ability to complete things. Many times the constraints feel very scattered because of the amount of cognitive load it takes to actually process all of those moving things. So whenever you're working with constraints, remember, it doesn't always feel so good to be the target of a lot of scrutiny. And also, there's nothing wrong with the constraint. It's not a character defect or a knowledge gap or some sort of flaw. It's a system effect. And when we don't actually understand as a system how we need to take it on, i.e. the methods that I laid out before, then we will oftentimes unintentionally or intentionally shame the constraint. And that ain't cool. So the other thing to think about constraints is that constrained people have actual needs. And when we talk about constrained people, sometimes it can be whole departments, right? I've never seen an organization that I've worked in that has enough network people or enough DBAs or, right? There's always some crucial function that's understaffed. And one of the things to remember about these folks is that they want your acceptance just like you want other people's acceptance, and they want your respect just like other people and you want to be respected. So at the end of the day, it's really, really important that we don't cause these folks to feel any, like I said, shame, any paranoia about being able to do enough. But again, that we reassure people that we know, hey, you're doing an amazing job. We're going to fix the system. We're going to continue to improve the system around us and you so that it's fair to all of us and that we can get things through here and we can feel good about the work we're doing. So again, if you remember that we all like to feel needed, right? But not on the other end where we're hopeless and we're actually trying to figure out how we're going to survive through all of this. So we need to understand also that the messaging some of us will give out when we're constrained may not allude to the fact that we're constrained. Sometimes we will actually speak in the way that we want to be able to act, but can't. Sometimes we will overcommit. It's not because the constraint is flaky. It's because the constraint has a dynamic environment that does not allow it and require it to focus on work in an ordered way. And then the other thing is, sometimes we'll actually say that we're not the constraint and we'll blame other people because we just don't want the attention. I don't need somebody focusing on my performance for 3 or 4 weeks straight when really the problem is the system. And you know what? That instinct is kind of right. But it doesn't mean that we don't analyze our own behavior and that we don't look at ways that we could change our behavior in order to get better performance. Matter of fact, all of what I'm talking about requires behavior change. Instead of just assuming that we know what's going on, we're expediting to help the constraint, which actually, by the way, hurts the constraint. We need to actually take stock and really think about what is it we're doing. The 5 focusing steps. Does this help or hurt the constraint? And does it help or hurt the system as it relates to getting more throughput? So briefly, there's an interesting angle to this particular webcast. I've given you some homework. And you're going to find an article and the homework in an email that will be sent to you afterwards. And basically, in this homework, I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to have you read a really great article and mine some answers out of that article and answer those 3 questions. So the article I mentioned to you was Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And that article appears at the end of the 30th anniversary edition of The Goal. Also, we will send a link to you for the article that you can read online. And there are 3 questions with this article that I would love for you to answer and really give it some thought. This is one of my favorite articles, by the way. I read this article all the time, and I've never really stopped getting new things out of it. A lot of people thought that Eliyahu Goldratt and Dr. Ono from Toyota were in some sort of theoretical competition, or somehow they were both arguing against each other. A lot of people thought that Goldratt had been really concerned about Toyota and other companies from Japan getting a hold of the theory of constraints. I'd like to actually say that that's not a true thing, that the theory of constraints is now a Japanese publication, and also that that this work has actually, Dr. Ono and Eliyahu had major respect for each other. And matter of fact, I think you'll hear some of that in this article. It's unfortunate that many people pit lean and the theory of constraints as competing bodies of knowledge and/or bodies that don't agree with each other. I think they're very complementary when you're talking about lean with the Toyota improvement kata in it. Without that, I don't think lean offers a ton of benefit in an ongoing situation in organizations. That is the secret that we were missing for so long. So read this article and really try and take it in. You might even need to read it twice. So many profound concepts inside of this. And so I look forward to actually seeing you guys respond to these 3 questions. What kind of production system did Dr. Ono wish to model Toyota after? Very, very clear over time when they would take visits to go look at these places, whenever they would think about ideas. Matter of fact, even some kind of fortunate things that happened on trips to go visit these places. Also, why couldn't he do the goal that he set out to do? There's some very concrete reasons in this article. And then when he created the Toyota production system along with Shigeo Shingo and Mr. Toyota, what was the constraint that Dr. Ono had to adjust for? And matter of fact, if you can find one, you can find two more. So look for three different constraints that Ono had to adjust for. If they're not in the article, they're in history. You should find them. So if you can go through and answer those questions and be ready for our next seminar, and I think you're going to really, really enjoy that. We're going to continue to build as we move through these, and I'm excited to do these two more. And then I'm excited if we can actually do a whole feature where we can do a regular series of these. So look forward to do that, and looking forward to hearing the answers of your questions.
Thank you, Kevin, for that wonderful overview of constraints. Again, it was a really fascinating approach of what is a constraint, and then how can you handle a constraint both as a leader, but then also if you are the constraint, and if you know the constraint, how can you actually interact with them and help them and enable them to stop being a constraint. So with that, we'll open the floor for some questions and answers. I see we already have some already. So I'll start with a question to Kevin. And then what I'd like is I'll be monitoring questions and answers. And if you have any questions, we'll give them to Kevin, and hopefully he'll get some answers. To very quickly summarize the last 30 minutes of Kevin's discussion is that constraints are the weakest link in a chain, and bottlenecks are where demand exceeds the design capacity of flow. And that's not always a bad thing. And everyone is going to have constraints. Every system is going to have some level of constraints, and sometimes that's by design. And then he went into several different types of constraints, which we've all dealt with before: cash constraints, market constraints, supply constraints as well. And then he highlighted the book, The Goal, which, as he mentioned, has over 3 million copies sold. Really a seminal work with regards to this whole idea and the theory of constraints. So and he talked about the 5 focusing steps: identify the constraint, exploit the constraint, subordinate to the constraint, elevate the constraint, and prevent it from becoming the constraint again. And finally, he said, or not finally, he talked about the constrained people, the people who are constraints. So with that being said, I'm going to offer a couple questions so we can make use of the time that we have together. Sure. And then, like I said, I'll be monitoring the Q&A. And if anything else comes to you, Kevin, please feel free. But for those folks, we appreciate your patience, and we will re-record in its entirety, and you will have all of this great content. So one question, Kevin, is can you talk about how management can make this whole constraint issue worse by expediting work to meet due dates? Oftentimes, with the best of intentions, management and leadership, with the best of intentions of trying to address an issue, can actually make the issue worse. So what are some things for them to keep in mind as they're looking at this?
Yeah. Basically, one of the, when you're in step one of this and you want to identify a constraint, one of the things that brings this up is like due date performance, right? This was supposed to be done Thursday or Saturday of last week. And now, it's a week later and we still don't have it, right? And so, customers get upset when they can't get things on time when they're promised. And so in order to keep business flowing, and customer relationships flowing, it makes a lot of sense in the situation to pick up the latest due date orders and say, hey, everybody, don't focus on the other ones. Let's just get these out. And what happens is, statistically over time, is due date performance gets much worse because the expediting doesn't just happen once. It now becomes a continual thing. And the more expediters we have, and an expediter in your tech organization could look like a product manager or a project manager coming up to you and saying, hey, so that thing you were supposed to get done yesterday, are you done with it? And then like an hour they come by and say, how about now? And then after a little while they say, I'm going to put more resources on it and we're going to elevate this task and take people off of other things so we can get this done, right? Kind of almost, incorporating some of the elements that we talked about on how you work around a constraint, but also kind of that expediting. And the key thing with expediting is that we put off tomorrow's work for the work we're doing now because we want to hit a deadline. But tomorrow's work is also now already late because there's a constraint in the system. So the problem is that we actually bypass the constraint in many ways in our minds when we have a solution, but it also comes back to haunt us when we have to resume normal operations because we're already behind. And so what you wind up with is a line or an organization that's all out of sync on where things are, and things have been worked on out of order, and it can make a lot of waste. And so I think the big thing that we want to do is have directionality, and we need to figure out why the due date performances aren't the way they're supposed to be, rather than put what seems like a Band-Aid, but actually I really believe is dirt, which has a likelihood of causing infections, right? It's just going to get worse. So I think expediting, in some cases you have to do it, but I think it's a key metric of how well your system is performing and how well you're understanding and working with your constraints.
That's for folks who haven't had a chance to listen to Kevin. As I mentioned, he's part of our global transformation office. It's kind of like talking to him about these topics is like talking to a jazz, or not talking. It's like dealing with like a jazz pianist that can just riff on stuff. So it's really fun because he goes many different directions and he brings in a lot of really cool insights. So thank you, Kevin. We have some great questions. So I wanted to ask one of them. So one of the questions was, how can leaders labeling them as special or even as poor performers that need help? The way that we communicate is obviously very important. Deal with the Brents, and how do we address the Brents without causing more issues? And we have a lot of questions, so if you can keep it to maybe just a few minutes on this, that would be great.
Sure. So again, I wanted to say that constrained resources are often constrained because of bad system design, but usually there's another component with it, which is that they become the default fast path for things because they are, in a way, special. They do solve a problem in the system for a local set of people, right? It's a local optima that says using Brent is the fastest, because we know if we use Brent, the whole system slows down. So it might be good for a small subset of people, right, who will continue to benefit from that. But what they need to see is that they're costing everybody, right? And so when people are singled out as being a constraint, and they're really great engineers, like in the story with Brent is one of the smartest people I've ever known in my life. He's a real person. He'll never forgive me for using his name in a novel. But Brent was one of the most amazing examples of a kind, giving, honest person with nothing but good intentions that would be in the middle of everything, everywhere he went. And so the things I often said to folks that were working with Brent, or when I was working with him, it was really not about being Brent's fault. And I think that if any resource or person, I don't like to use the word resource, and I've used it a lot today, any person that is constrained can feel like something's wrong with them, or that maybe they're not enough. And if you use language where you're talking about their performance being poor, well, don't let them do that. That's what a lot of managers will say. Just tell them no. You have to understand that constrained resources are servants in their hearts, like they want to help, right? And so the big thing is they have the ability to help. And these people probably don't have stray dogs or cats in their neighborhood. This is the kind of compassion I'm talking about. They will take things in. That is not bad, and you do not want to discourage that. And so it's important to ask a constrained person, hey, am I making statements that cause you to feel uncomfortable, or maybe it's hard to understand what I'm saying? Am I making you, not making you, but am I saying things that you're interpreting as like something that's wrong with you? Because I want to make sure that that's not the case. It takes more than saying that they're not a problem. It takes actually saying that they're valuable and you can't imagine living without them, right? You have to affirm the fact that they are necessary, but they can't be superheroes because they got to be able to take a vacation without getting interrupted. They have to be able to have a conversation with their significant other. They need to be able to spend eye-to-eye time with their children in, actual paying full attention and presence. They can't do that when they're feeling like they're a problem, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's a great point in terms of, you've heard a theme for the folks that are with us. You've heard a theme. It's about empathy, right? It's about compassion. And a lot of times people think about that as like a squishy idea, like, oh, be more compassionate. But there's actually many business studies, studies around the idea of psychological safety, around compassion, about how you approach people. And the thing about this is we all know this in our personal lives as well. So it's just the same thing, extending that in our business life. Question here that I wanted to read out here. And if it's possible to go back to the previous slides, I don't know if that is, but the 5 steps of the resolutions of constraint.
Oh, the 5 focusing steps?
There was yeah, if we can go back to that 5 focusing steps. So the question was this, they basically said that they have a Brent problem, but they wanted to ask specifically an example of elevating the constraint. What does that mean? And because we had some audio issues, which sounds like maybe you can just very briefly go through each 5, just again, very quickly. And then specifically the question was around elevation of the constraint, and give an example of that.
Sure. So first, obviously, identifying the constraint, very, very important. Remember, I pointed out that all bottlenecks are not, in fact, constraints. Exploit the constraint literally means make sure that you have the constraint only focusing on the most valuable work that is requiring the constraint's attention. What is constrained? That is all they do until that is all done. Subordinate to the constraint means at this point you're involving other people that could be causing the constraint problems, i.e. not making work at the right pace for the constraint, overproducing, underproducing. So what we want to do is ask all the people around the constraint that work with them to say, hey, listen, anything you can do that will help Brent, it may hurt you a little bit, but you're not constrained, right? You all focus on helping Brent however you can. Like literally, if it just means not getting what you need, not asking for something, just give them space. So elevate is really, really important because we want to do the first 2 steps, the first 3 steps before we do this. Elevate I equals to spending money. So we are now going to invest to help the constraint produce more. That could mean more Brents. We could add more people, not Brents, but we could add, they could be named Brent. But I think the most important part is we're talking about more resources at the point of constraint, right? One of the things that I think Ellie said that was so vital is if you are not solving problems at the point of constraint, whatever you're doing doesn't matter. Literally, every piece of attention must go to the constrained resource. That is why it's so important to have empathy. It's really important to have empathy over ego in these scenarios. We all want to be the most important person in the world, right? But at the end of the day, we all need somebody else to be successful so that we can all be successful. So I think elevating the constraint means that we're going to spend money, time, we're going to maybe buy more machinery, maybe buy more space in the cloud for Brent's processes to run. We're investing. And you want to do that after you really understand the problem and you figured out if it's not just an organizational issue, in other words, subordination for flow, if it's not just actually a job description issue or a misunderstanding of their role. Exploiting the constraint says you are free to do nothing but this. And that is really important. So giving them freedom in here before you have to spend money, because I can tell you, if you spend money on a constraint and it doesn't make their life better, that whole thing about being inadequate, that whole thing about being focused on, that whole idea about people not understanding what the problems really are, that becomes really, really salient to somebody in that position and quite bad. It's not an anabolic or strength building experience, right? It's a tear you down. So I think that elevating is really important. But again, I want to emphasize our first instinct is to whip out the wallet, because the wallet's easier than getting people to go along and agree with us. And having hard conversations about optimizing and focusing on a global optima instead of a local optima.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Hopefully that answered the question for the person that asked it, but that's a great overview again. And actually, not surprisingly, we have another question on content because people got about 50% of the words you said. So they're trying to mentally connect the dots. So if we can go back to the slide where you talked about one of the techniques was channeling. And so one of the questions was that, can you tell us more about channeling and how that is interesting perspective on the question was, how is that, maybe you can just spend 30 seconds explaining channeling again, but their question was, how is that received by Brent?
Oh, Brent hates it, and I can tell you why. I mean, but I'll talk a little bit about it. So channeling, the notion of saying, Brent, teach, don't do, and teach in the situation. So walk them through it, and the goal. We know you were successful at the end if that person says, "Got it. I could do this without you, Brent." Or it's even mildly successful to saying, "Hey, I think I could do this, but Brent, could you just look at it when I'm done?" So like it's that shoe-ra-ree kind of moment where we teach people how to do it exactly the right way. And then we watch them do it exactly the right way. And then Brent doesn't have to hang around for when they make it their own, which is the third step, right? When you like learn it enough where you go, oh, now I think I could do it better this way. So, or this is more natural for me. So I think those three steps in that process, the first two need to be done by Brent, right? And management needs to get involved to make sure it happened, because otherwise this is a totally not natural thing. And the instinct about how does it feel if you're Brent is right. You may feel like you're being disciplined. And more importantly, since you're already constrained and you're already maybe anxious about the work you have to do that you can't get to, and any promises you may have broken by helping other people along the way, there's like a mixed bag of stuff going on in there. So the last thing you want to do is penalize that process, right? So understand that, constrained folks there's an anxiety that goes along with that. And also the sense that maybe you're not quite enough, or you should be able to do this better. So the channeling part can single them out, but after a little while, you might actually see the opposite thing happen. And this never happened with Brent, but I've seen this with constraints that I've used similar techniques with over the past, which is they might actually like it. They might actually see it as a promotion. Yeah, I don't do that anymore. So here's where you're going to learn. And that is amazing. It sounds terrible, but it is amazing because the Brent has basically where the resource or person, not resource, but the person at that point has said and internalized, hey, I can have a different reaction to this problem that goes along with the correct system reaction. So I can, like, in a weird way, skateboard downhill by saying, hey, better, we should teach you. If I get caught doing this, not good, right? I'm bad, Brent. And I said, but if you get caught knowing how to do this, it's all high fives, we win. And the best part is I never have to answer that question, because now the next person can channel you. And all we have to do is keep skills liquidity updated. In other words, Brent taught me how to do this. So whenever we're looking through what skills we've got or what skills we're building, we can actually also see, hey, Brent has all these skills. We use way too many of these skills. Let's get some folks built up. So it takes a holistic approach as a manager to work with Brent. But I think you have to really involve Brent, because Brent knows things about it that you don't. Here's the other thing. If you can get Brent into the habit of emptying his closet once a week with you and telling you all the things that are in there, like a confessional. I know you made commitments and I know you're going to want to meet them all. And I know they were amazing, amazing things you wanted to do. Can you tell me so that I can go pick up the pieces for you? That's humble as a leader, right? Because you're going to go pick up some pieces. You're going to subordinate in a way to the constraint. You're going to manage the system, and it's going to feel like too much work, but it's also going to inspire you to follow these 5 freaking steps, because you got to get that constraint out of your hair, because your job is to find the next one, manager, and find the next one, and find the next one. You keep the system moving. That's your job. And I think that is really important.
Well, thank you. And that's again, that's a great point there in terms of, again, looking at both sides of it, what the leader can do. For those of us who are on this phone that on this call are leaders, that's, again, Kevin has been talking about what you can do, but then what can you do as a Brent? And one of the ways I know that someone described this, Brent, I'm speaking to Brent now, you have to take part in your own rescue. And that's really just part of it. That's part of it as well. And now the leader should make you feel empowered that you have the ability to do that. But at some point, Brent has to take some steps as well, and everyone will be better for it as well. So that's a great, and one of the main themes here for all of us, of course, is that this is not just about technology, right? This is really about its technology, its people, its process, its values, its culture. And that's one of the things that Kevin, in his role as one of the heads of our global transformation office, helps organizations to navigate through that. So as I said, if you have, we can certainly, if you were, someone had written a question which was, I'm a Brent, and what are some of the things I could do? One of the things you could do is, if you were interested, Red Hat can coordinate an executive exchange. So some of these messages that you're hearing, Kevin can deliver them directly to your executive management. And that's something that we've seen has actually been received very well. Yeah. So we have some more questions. We'll just go to the end of the hour, top of the hour. So the question was, how can a constraint take the more needed space and avoid interruptions without becoming rude and unavailable? So I'm the constraint, and I want to now take a little bit of space. I want to say no, but
right.
How do you say no without becoming rude to people?
Yeah, this is a thing that I deal with in continuous improvement all the time. So I love working with a small team that's like 5 or 6 people, and saying, or 10, up to 10. But one of the fun things to do is make the group aware of what's going on with the constraint dynamic. A lot of times, if you're the constraint and you're having to tell everybody you're the constraint, that doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good for a variety of reasons. You might feel like you're saying, yeah, hey, do my work. But here's the thing. You need whoever's running the team, in terms of management, needs to make other people aware around you and in the projects and things that you're in, to let people know Brent is extremely constrained. I know what Brent is doing. You may not, but the point is you want to let everybody know that it's super important, right? And if there are problems with Brent, I hear about them. So what I would like is for you folks to actually respect what Brent is asking you to do, because it is in fact what I've asked him to do, right? And so Brent, in this scenario, really part of being the physician that heals himself or herself, they have to, in this scenario, literally pick themselves up and go to management. I am a constraint and I cannot be micromanaged out of this. There is a process that works. Here's what it is. I would like to participate in with you, and here's an experiment I would like to do, and actually lay out a small experiment using a subset of some of this approach. And what I have found is if you get them involved, don't let them push away and go, yeah, go do your experiment, tell me what happens. You want them involved. You say, well, how would I know it worked from your perspective? Because the thing you want to do is involve somebody who has a stake in the system, not the work. And that is the mistake we make, is that when we're trying to help ourselves not be constrained or constrained less, because there is a phase where we all do this. We try and appeal to people around us. Am I the only one going through this? Right. And sometimes people just don't say anything. And so I think it's really important to engage the group, and then the larger groups, if that is how big the constraint is. In the organizations I was in, Brent was such a large constraint that it was something that we talked about among executives. It's kind of funny, right? And I remember a certain executive telling me, I wish I was getting as much attention as Brent. And I went, it's funny because I don't think Brent likes it. So it is hard. It does go against the archetype of people in some cases that want to help. So the last thing you want to do is break the spirit of people being helpful and empathetic in your organization. So yeah, the way Brent can say those things is very simple without being a jerk. I have been told under no certain terms that I am supposed to do this. I will tell you, I don't like it because I know I'm giving you something that I feel like I should do. But apparently I'm wrong. Using your ability to say I was wrong about doing all of this because I can't do all of this. That humble student part works so much better than back off or putting on headphones or all of the visual cues you can use to show people that you are completely not interested in what they're saying. So I think rather than passive aggression, Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to pull in our real feeling inside. The way we feel when we feel a little maybe hopeless, maybe a little overwhelmed. Remember that feeling. Give it a handle so you can come back to it, because you're going to need to. Because in this conversation, you're going to need to remind yourself, oh, that's where I go if I give in here. And where the only place I'm giving in is me. I don't have to confront the person. I just have to not give in to making the same mistake. Right? So if it becomes a dispute, that's something you can resolve with management. And it's not comfortable. But I'm telling you, the only way to get out of, being interrupted with your significant other all the time and not being able to have clear space to do the cool, fun stuff you want to do because you have a brilliant mind. Like, you used to have hobbies, Brent, right? So those things that are you are what you get. The things that make you feel terrible are what you get if you keep deciding that way. So there's a little pivot you can kind of, in that moment where it happens, you have a chance to make a different decision and just say, I've messed this up really bad in the past, which may or may not be true. You can find a way to say that that's genuine and true. This is something that I didn't see that was bad in the past, apparently, or this is a way we can work together better. Phrase it as a positive thing, but make it about your revelation, your seeing, your wanting the whole team to win. And I think, like I said, getting management involved is really important, but it doesn't come down to saying no. If you have to say no, what you're saying is not right now. I'm going to make sure somebody gets on this, or how about you do that? How about you take this over there because you're going to get done faster? Figure out a way to present the benefit of them not using somebody who's not going to get to it. I think that's important.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And just to kind of highlight something Kevin said, or one of the themes really of today's conversation, and really Kevin's ethos, I say, is most of us are in technology. We work at organizations, but we're still people. And the human interactions that we have are still human interactions. So as Kevin said, if we're passive aggressive outside of work, perhaps we're bringing that into work. Mm. And so how do we say no? It's the same way you say no to somebody else outside of work, really, in the end of the day, right? So it's a really, good reminder. We are actually almost out of time. We did have some more questions. We can't really get to them. What I did want to wrap up by saying, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming and for hanging in there. We're going to re-record this, so you can take this as if you were all part of a intimate dry run, intimate fireside chat with Kevin on this topic. So what we'll do is we'll record it, we'll send it out, and then we definitely would encourage you to send it out to others. This is the first of 3 webinars. I anticipate the next webinars to go much smoother. What you see here is this is the homework for this webinar. So it's this article. We will send out the link, and there are 3 questions that Kevin had highlighted for you all to answer. So those are going to be sent out as well. So your homework is going to be read this article and then answer the 3 questions. Then when we start the next webinar, we are going to spend a few minutes to review the homework. So we want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Kevin, for your insight as always. And we look forward to seeing you guys in the same place, not same time, but same place, to have webinar number 2. And then after that, webinar number 3. And I will say, if we get enough of a interest, perhaps we can get Kevin to do even a longer series about this. Because again, there are dozens of lessons that we can take from the Phoenix Project. So thank you, everybody. We weren't able to get to all the questions, but I appreciate it. And thank you again. And I hope everyone, you and your loved ones, are safe and healthy. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.